Hey everyone, this is Taylor McGivney. I'm a project director for i4Pharma, and I welcome you warmly to this i4Pharma Oncology webinar. I hope you got your settings adjusted. Make sure you can hear comfortably, and I'd actually encourage you to take a moment, close your inbox, and just listen to what's going to be a fascinating discussion. I suggest you listen in and make sure you send questions into our panelists and participate in the live polls. Ultimately, we put this webinar on for you following demands from our network, so I want you to get the best out of it. Our topic today is demonstrating value and price, how to incorporate new value frameworks into your research. And I'm quite excited to welcome more than 600 registrants from across the U.S. and even international participants to our seminar. We're organizing this as part of our oncology initiative that is culminating in our 2016 Industry Summit, June 16th and 17th. If you don't know, i4Pharma is a conveyor of thought leadership, and we're all driven to make the pharma industry more open and valued. So I hope you join as we're creating a movement for leaders who want to prioritize value and, importantly, value for patients. I am proud that we have 4 of these change makers with us for the hour. And without much further ado, I'd like to introduce our moderator for today, Jennifer Hinkle of McGivney Global Advisors. Jennifer will outline the topics in more detail and introduce our esteemed panel with Mike Kaloji of Aetna, Steve Paulson of Texas Oncology, and our good friend Jack Whelan, cancer expert and warrior, who is giving you the honest patient perspective. Jennifer, over to you.
Good afternoon, everyone, and good morning to those on the West Coast. Taylor, thanks for the introduction. I'm Jennifer Hinkle from McGivney Global Advisors. And again, joining us today to discuss value and price in oncology, we have Dr. Michael Kaloji, the National Medical Director at Aetna, Dr. Steve Paulson, CEO of Texas Medical Oncology, and Jack Whelan, Cancer Warrior. He will bring us a great patient-centered perspective. I'm a health economist consulting for pharma and biotech, and I'm also a cancer survivor. So I think between the 4 of us, we can represent a number of stakeholder perspectives on this topic, and we're looking forward to a very robust and interactive discussion. You may know there is a little chat window in the webinar box, and so as you come up with questions or comments, please feel free to type those in, and I will incorporate those into the session today. So as we're facing a changing market landscape in oncology with an ever brighter spotlight shined on drug pricing, the high cost of cancer drugs is a very hot topic, and we see this both in headlines and in political debate. Pharma and biotech manufacturers are under increased pressure to demonstrate the value of their products in a transparent way. And as part of this environment, we're seeing other stakeholders outside of pharma and biotech manufacturers and outside of payers create oncology value metrics that seek to define and in some cases assign scores or ratings to pharma and biotech products, as well as to other interventions in oncology based on various factors. So my first question, and this is for everyone on the panel, apart from some of the metrics that we've seen as most prominent, which I would say are the NCCN evidence blocks right now in the ASCO value framework, are there other value metrics in oncology that we should be aware of, and what are those? Dr. Paulson, do you have thoughts from what you've seen in the clinic?
We use U.S. Oncology Clear Value Pathways, or Clear Value Plus, which is an amalgamation of the NCCN guidelines, but it also takes it one step further in imputing cost information into the pathway analysis. And so you have your basic analysis of efficacy and toxicity, but you also have factored in the financial toxicity of a particular program. So you may have NCCN pathways that encompass 6 or 7 different frontline therapies. Ours may only encompass 3 or 4 and may exclude some based on relatively high cost without greater efficacy than the alternative. So that certainly is the pathways that we use internally within our practice and on a larger basis in the U.S. Oncology Network.
Thanks. And Jack, I'm going to turn to you and ask whether you think patients understand these types of metrics and whether they represent a patient view of value at all.
Sure, that sounds good. I think, I'd look at putting patients into certain stratified groups, if you will. Patients that have a temporary illness probably really have no interest in this discussion, but those that have a chronic illness or lethal disease of some kind, someone that's going to require care for over a longer period of time, they'd be keenly interested. This movement into the e-patient movement or patient advocates that are actively involved in their care, they're more likely to look at things like the NCC evidence blocks favorite happens to be the ASCO value framework. I mean, I think they've done a superb job. This team they put together did a superb job really understanding from the patient's perspective. So I think that the typical patient today is not going to look into it. But in the near future, as we get much better at providing real value in patient care, providing much more specific targeted therapies, I think patients will get on board. But right now, I don't see a lot of keen interest except those that have a chronic disease.
And Dr. Cloutier, are there certain among these metrics that you think payers are more likely to use than others? And are you using any of these specific metrics in practice at Aetna currently?
So I think the question, Jennifer, is what does use mean? So I think for the pharma folks on the call, the fear is that use might mean determined coverage policy. And so, of course, the answer is no. Coverage policy is largely dictated by law or by state insurance coverage mandates. Therefore, if a drug is FDA approved, then for most payers, compendia listed, especially NCCN compendia listed, it's a covered benefit. And that is just the way it is in America. So do we use these coverage determinations? The answer is no. Do I see us ever using them for coverage determination? The answer is no. However, if you define use by formulary placement, the answer is not yet, but maybe in the future. And then, of course, the third possible definition of use is inform clinical pathways synthesis and maybe a way to promote value-based decision-making. The answer is yes, we use them now, and yes, we will use them in the future, and we won't be the only ones who use them in the future. So I think the definition of use is critical here.
And so we've put a question out to the audience, and we have another question coming that gets a little bit more to that point of how these might be incorporated or how people perceive they might be incorporated into coverage pathways and perhaps formulary tiering in the future. And so in the poll, we asked which of these pricing models or value models might most fairly and accurately assess the price of drugs. And coming back from the audience, 35% said that they felt ICER was the most fair and accurate, which actually is a surprise to me, being out and talking to many of you in the pharma and biotech industry. And then the ASCO value framework, 21% of respondents chose that, and 15% chose the NCCN evidence blocks, with 20% saying other. So I think there's a wide distribution in how people are perceiving these metrics, and maybe all of our understanding of what these are and the potential for their use is evolving. And I think we're going to put up another poll question now that asks more about how we perceive these might be used in upcoming years. So Dr. Cloutier, I'm just going to come back to you for a second and ask, do you think that these are going to be used more as the inform, that third way that you talked about, as they're shaping pathways, or do you think that there will be a point at which the decisions become very explicit, and so companies will have to think about achieving a certain score, a certain number in some of these value frameworks or rating systems so that they will be able to get a preferred placement or be able to get on formulary or into a pathway?
I just want to comment briefly on the answers to that last poll. Let's be clear on what ICER is and what ICER is not. ICER's scope is very limited, right? NCCN and ASCO consider a much larger breadth of clinical questions. They have different methodology than ICER. I suppose we could conclude that people like the rigor with which ICER approaches questions, but we should not in any way, shape, or form think that what ICER does is like what NCCN or ASCO does. It's totally different. So that I just wanted to say that very quickly. So it's really interesting. I think people have this impression that this is going to be driven by the payer. They're wrong. It's not going to be driven by the payer. It's actually going to be driven by the providers. It's going to be driven by the oncologists. And the reason it's going to be driven by the oncologist, and to some extent, I think patients should be really happy by that. It's going to make sure that when there's a clinically superior opportunity or a clearly clinically inferior opportunity, that patients are protected by the guardrails of a clinical pathways program or an NCCN evidence block or an ASCO construct. And I think it is going, as we go towards reimbursement reform, it's going to define a construct in which oncologists understand where there's an absolute expectation for provider performance and where there may be an arena in which there may not be a clearly best answer. And in the arena in which there's not clearly a best answer, then I think everybody needs to recognize that we need to develop the data set, and that data set should include a real-world evidence and actually patient-reported outcomes and patient preference. So I think that we perhaps mistakenly think this is a hammer that the payers are going to use. It's not. It's going to be a tool that oncologists use to try to make sure that they do the right thing within a novel reimbursement methodology.
Thanks.
Mike, this is Jack. I'd like to just comment on that. I agree with you. I think the ASCO framework in particular is pretty encompassing. It's very broad-based, and the NCC guidelines as well. That for me, as the patient perspective, I think the real value is that it is a framework. It's a list of questions, a list of concerns, things to think about when adjudicating whether coverage would be provided. The fact that we're even addressing the possibility of clinical trials as an effective treatment option, we never would do that in the past. My only concern with both of these is that we're still not addressing the issue of rare disease. Many rare diseases, in fact, the more we learn about cancers, the more rare they're going to become. Many of them don't have an FDA-approved drug, and I'm concerned when we embrace some kind of an approval that says we'll provide coverage or not based on FDA approval. I think that kind of shuts the door for many, and I hope in the near future either ASCO or NCCN will open up that discussion.
This is Steve. To comment on the rare disease issue, most rare diseases are not covered or have pathways because they are rare, and the experience with that is minimal or modest. And in practicality, what Mike says is exactly right. The guidelines are preferably developed by physicians and utilized by physicians. We don't want to be in a position where we don't regulate and moderate our own behavior, and as a result, somebody creates rigid rules that make it more difficult for us to take the best care of the patient. So I agree with Mike completely. Mike's been on both sides of that discussion and understands that physicians want to be in a position of creating their own future and their own set of rules as opposed to having them handed by somebody else. The other part of that is that these rules are not meant to be rigid, as I said earlier. They're typically a guideline, or guidelines encompass 3, 4, 5 different options and are only narrowed by comorbid conditions and other things that have some rationale for using or not utilizing a particular therapy. And then the financial input that says if you have 4 things that are relatively equally effective and one of them costs 4 times as much, that's not going to be one of the choices that you choose. If you have something that's superior, and we always use efficacy and toxicity as our first 2 choices in terms of looking at therapeutic options, then cost becomes the third arbiter of utilization.
Yeah, this is Mike. So I want to come back to Jack's point about rare diseases, and I would totally agree that the current clinical pathways constructs, without a doubt, ICER and Drug Abacus do not approach the rare disease or even the personalized medicine approach. But let's think about whether or not we would feel comfortable objective process that goes into the ASCO value framework, the NCCN evidence block. Are we comfortable with that as a framework by which we see the value of novel therapies, or let's just say individualized approaches within clinical subsets of? I think the idea individual requires an approach that is just for that one individual is probably wrong. I think what is much more likely is subsets of individuals, and they may be relatively small subsets, but there'll be subsets that will be treated in a relatively similar fashion. I think the question is whether or not value constructs applicable to a subset analysis, and most importantly, that we need to develop a construct by which information transparent to come to some kind of place with what constitutes works and what constitutes this doesn't work, and then once we get past that point, what constitutes this work at what price. And I think that's actually the challenge, right? The challenge of a cancer link, of registries, or the challenge of learning from what we do in rare diseases so that more people with rare diseases can benefit from what we've learned, right? That's just my view of it.
And I agree. And like to that extent, any chance you have for a rare or very uncommon illness to be enrolled in a clinical trial when there is not clear evidence of a specific effective therapy still becomes really important. There's no way to advance that knowledge of that disease on doing things on a kind of an a la carte basis and such. So I think it's important that when you do have rare illnesses that don't have an obvious effective therapy, that those patients, you at least attempt to enroll them in a clinical trial.
Thanks. This is Jennifer, and I'm going to slightly redirect the conversation because we have some input back from the audience in a poll where 48%, so it was split about 50-50, so half nearly of the audience thought that it was very probable that payers are going to start using these metrics in an explicit fashion in the next 3 years. So I think that's interesting discussion leading on from what Dr. Cloget, you had said earlier. But the next question that I want to put to everyone is that I perceive that one of the challenges of these metrics is that value doesn't have a set definition, and the way that each of these groups approaches value is a little bit different. And I think the way that payers, patients, manufacturers, and providers define value might be different. So I want to ask all of you, do you feel that there's consensus in what the definition of value is, or is there room for debate still in how different stakeholder groups may perceive value, and how might that impact the use and development of these sorts of metrics?
Jennifer, this is Steve Paulson. I think value is a challenge. You look in the dictionary, there's 8 or 10 different definitions, but from a treatment perspective, value in my mind is a measure of outcome with sort of divided by cost. So outcome to me means duration of life, quality of life, but it also means some measure of the cost or the impact financially on the patient. So I do think value is becoming much more of a conversation these days. The cost of cancer care is rising at about 12 to 15% a year. That's an unsustainable curve, and I think that if you don't discuss value with your patients at some point in time, you're destined to put a a goodly number of them into bankruptcy.
Thank you. Jack, would you say that patients have the same perception of value, or are there other things that patients are thinking about?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think to be totally honest, most patients are really not thinking seriously about value. They're thinking, how are we going to fix this? And, whether it's a $100,000 problem that someone's going to pay for, or $500,000 problem, most patients really aren't seriously thinking about the financial impact of, especially if it's a lethal disease of some kind. They're thinking about survival. And if you don't survive, then the patient's saying, well, I'm not really worried about value. I'm sorry to be brutally honest, but I think if you polled most patients and said, how do you really feel about this? Now, there's definitely the issue of financial toxicity. And as we, get better with these targeted therapies, they're considered pharmacy coverage rather than medical coverage. And in the U.S., we have a, distinctly American problem here. We make a very substantial difference between pharmacy coverage and medical coverage. If I sit in an infusion chair and get medical coverage, I'm paid for 100%. But if I take a pill form of that therapy, of a, very specific targeted therapy, that may only cost, let's say, $10,000 for the pill, while the infusion cost is $75,000, I'll be fully reimbursed for the $75K because it's medical coverage. So this is an example where we don't really express value in a sort of total cost of ownership, where we really look at the complete cost of the therapy, rather than just looking at the pharmacy cost. And we've got to get past that, and we better do it quickly, because we're making some serious judgment errors in value today. Pill form chemotherapy, in most cases, is far less expensive than infusion. But when you have 100% coverage, you're going to be driven to take the more expensive rather than the more intelligent value play. That gives you an idea of how seriously we are, falling short of the definition of value here.
Jack, to a certain extent, I think that the challenge you have is that the word cancer creates a desperate situation for most patients. And, in some circumstances, they're focused on their own personal situation, and all they can say is, I don't care what it costs, fix me. But a lot more patients practically look at what the effect on their families could be and the financial potential effect on them in terms of if they don't survive. So it's a mixed bag in terms of the way patients view it, and I think it probably differs in terms of the region in the United States that people are in. It also varies by their background. So I do think there is a great deal of variability about that. I do think that the overall cost of care is much more important to look at. That's what I think many of the bundled insurance products are looking at, the overall cost of care and trying to rationalize that. And I think that in time, it will be about the overall cost, not just what's reimbursable, what's not.
And so we have a couple questions coming in through the audience, and we have a question specifically for you, Jack. You just mentioned the oral cost versus the total cost, and I know there's been a lot of discussion lately about oral parity laws. And so do the oral parity laws address that price or value difference, do you think?
In the U.S., I think about 30 states have now passed what's called the oral parity legislation, which basically says commercial insurance providers must provide parity or equal coverage, whether a patient is receiving it in pill form or infusion form. And this only applies to commercial insurance. It doesn't provide for any federal or state, any government programs at all. So, the majority of cancer patients, most of whom will be on Medicare, don't get that level of coverage. So I think there's still a pretty wide gap, although more than 30 states have passed this requirement for commercial insurance. We still have a long way to go.
Yep.
Yeah, this is Mike. So we can talk about oral parity, but let's just take classic Medicare. Take classic Medicare, where this discussion is irrelevant. And in classic Medicare, if you don't have a secondary, you are responsible for 20% of the cost of services, whether they be infusion. And then, of course, if you have bought up to a Medicare Part D benefit, you have significant out-of-pocket. Now, why is that the purest case? And the reason that's the purest case is Nancy Keating just published a really lovely article about how much out-of-pocket for the average Medicare beneficiary is, even considering the disappearance of the donut hole and even considering catastrophic coverage. And she showed extremely nicely that for the average Medicare beneficiary, for these expensive specialty drugs, this is Medicare, those Medicare beneficiaries could have $10,000 out of pocket in a year. Now, that is about 40% of what the average Medicare beneficiary has coming in a year. So no matter how you slice this pie, the cost of the drugs is really, really high. Benefit parity may reduce a little bit the amount that a commercially insured member would experience. But actually what it does more typically is it changes the distribution of the out-of-pocket rather than the total out-of-pocket. Because most cancer patients do in fact, they hit up against that max out-of-pocket, which is $60-some $100 this year, and most commercial members who hit that max out-of-pocket, that's still a substantial amount of money that they're bringing home in a given year. So I think we can talk about oral parity, but oral parity, in fact, is not going to change the problem of the fact that cancer patients are being asked to spend a lot of money because the cost of therapy is so high. That's just truth.
Mike, that's a very valid point, but I'm going back to the word value. The value for targeted, pill form chemotherapy is dramatically less than the cost of infusion therapy. It's not unusual to see infusion costs be in that $50,000 per month, where pill form is more likely to be at $10,000 a month. And nonetheless, the patient's still picking up about $2,800 a month, up to the maximum of the $6,500, which resets every year. So the real value question here is, how much is the industry paying? And it's really silly to even consider making a decision to get infusion coverage because you're getting 100% coverage. It makes no sense when the cost of the therapeutic is so much less when it's in pill form. There shouldn't even be a debate on this. It helps to illustrate how little we understand true value here.
Well, Jack, you're leaving out part of the equation, though, and one of the challenges you have with oral therapy is patient compliance. We have no way of knowing after a patient leaves the center whether or not the patient is continuing to take that medication that may nauseate them. They're concerned about the cost, whatever. So we have no way of monitoring compliance with oral agents. That's not to say that they're not useful, and that's not to say that a motivated patient won't take it. But let me give you an example of the flip of what you're talking about, and that is a drug like Xeloda, which is an oral agent, easy to take, is substantially greater in cost than the alternative, which is a combination of leucovorin and 5-FU. And there's a substantial amount of savings by giving the patient infusion in the office, but it's less convenient. So you can't really generalize about whether or not a specific oral therapy is more cost effective or better than IV. In many patients, there are effective and cheaper IV agents to the oral agents that are also used in a particular diagnosis.
And let me be clear that the average cost of a 4 month a course of chemotherapy in the U.S. is approximately $25,000. That's across the board. Okay. So when you've got an oral drug that comes in at $10,000 a month, there is no way that the cost to, quote, society is less for the oral agent. It's simply not true. It's just not true. And that number has actually been published.
I have to show to you, Michael. I completely disagree. From a patient's perspective, when you make a decision whether you're going to get 100% coverage or not, that's really very important. I'll be happy to show you stacks of invoices, the difference between many pill form agents and infusion costs. Again, infusion cost is considered medical coverage. There's no debate, it's 100% coverage. Pharmacy coverage is not 100%. The co-insurance on pharmacy coverage is still very substantial for many patients. And that's what again, it just goes back to the question of value. I don't want to belabor this. I just think it's a very, very important point. I think as Stephen pointed out, there's no clear-cut rules. These have to be decided on a per patient basis. Nonetheless, the evidence is very clear that there's a wide gap between pharmacy coverage and medical coverage.
And to a certain extent, Jack, I 100% agree. There is a great deal of variability. If you want to impute an even more difficult question into the whole issue of value, if you look at site of service and the whole issue of site of service parity between reimbursement, infusion in a physician office is about 1x. A hospital outpatient department is 2 to 2.5x, and in some of our academic centers, the cost of that therapy could be as much as 3 to 4 times what it is for the exact same therapy. So, I mean, again, when you go back to what I find value is some measure of outcomes divided by cost. By just keeping everything same but increasing the cost, you've substantially decreased the value. I think the same thing is true when you're trying to make a generalization about oral versus IV therapies. It really depends a great deal. In some diseases like myeloma, there's some very inexpensive IV therapy and some very expensive oral therapies. And I think you just have to be careful not to sort of throw everything into one big wastebasket.
Yeah, this is Jennifer. I have a question for Dr. Cloutier. When you're talking about the average cost, what cost or what price, I guess, are you looking at? Because you could look at the average cost as the list price, but you could also look at it as the out-of-pocket price that patients pay. You could also look at it as the acquisition price to a clinic or to a 340B hospital. All of these pieces could be really different. So from your perspective, what are you thinking of as cost? And for everyone else on the panel, what should we be looking at as cost, and how should we be looking at it when we don't have one price that's consistent for everyone?
That's why Medicare is such a perfect case, because there is one price for Medicare. It's claims paid. So when I say $25,000, I say $25,000 claims paid. So let's dissect this discussion, this question into two issues. One is the issue of how much does it cost America? How much does it cost all of the Aetna members to treat a patient with intravenous chemotherapy, just the drug, versus the oral agent, just the oral agent? How much does it cost total? And the answer is, I told you, it's $25,000 for claims paid for chemotherapy, for a course of intravenous chemotherapy. And I've told you that it's more than that for an oral drug. That's true. Now let's flip it around. How much does it cost the member? How much does it cost the patient? And as Jack has correctly stated, whether it's right or wrong, it is the way it is. Oral agents tend to be on a co-insurance. If they're on a specialty tier, they tend to be managed with a co-insurance strategy. So you pay and then you pay a co-insurance commercial member to the max out-of-pocket as defined by the ACA. And for patients treated with injectable chemotherapy, it is typically a deductible followed by a co-payment model in which they pay a certain amount for every time they come in for infusion. All I'm saying, it's a simple argument, is that if you're getting cancer therapy, you're going to achieve your max out-of-pocket irrespective of whether it's a deductible plus co-payment, deductible plus co-insurance. You will achieve your max out-of-pocket. The difference is how you achieve it. If you're on a co-insurance model, and that would be your specialty pharmacy drugs, you achieve it in the first 2 months, right? Because of the way that pharmacy claims are paid. It takes you longer on a co-payment system but you ultimately do achieve your max out-of-pocket. Almost everybody with cancer does, right? So what Jack says is true. If you look at the EOBs, they're different, but they're different in an individual month. They may not be different in terms of the member year. That's my only argument. Now, you may say, well, we hate that. We hate that. We wanted to have it, we want to have it amortized over the calendar year. And so there are people actually looking at those models. Much in oncology, though. They're looking at it in Hep C, right? They're looking at how to take care of that issue in Hep C, a potentially curative therapy. And I'm certainly not going to defend specialty pharmacy and how the specialty pharmacy benefit evolved and why it evolved. That's not my place. All I'm saying is that if we look at the total cost, there's little question that are administered on the specialty pharmacy benefit are really expensive. And oral parity can only go so far in terms of fixing the challenge, which is the patient out-of-pocket challenge.
I just think we're never going to come to an agreement on this because it goes back to the very basic issue. We delineate what is pharmacy coverage and what's medical coverage. They don't do this in Europe and other nations. For some reason, we've never finished the negotiation for specialty tiers that was started many years ago. We still have the donut hole problem that seniors face. We still have the formulary issues. There are a whole variety of issues that completely skirt the issue of value. And I'm telling you, until you're personally faced with this, you may think that $6,500 isn't a lot. For a lot of seniors, that's a lot of money. That's coming right out of your retirement fund, or it's coming right out of whatever you have. And to face that every January is a major issue. And it's still a major issue because it's pharmacy. It's not medical coverage, gentlemen.
Just a comment, because you brought in the European connection. I think if you step back, there's a couple things that they have in Europe that we don't have here. One is they have panels which reject drugs as being too expensive for the value added. That's not present in the United States, and maybe it should be. And the other thing they do is that they structure negotiations with the pharmaceutical industry and a pricing structure that allows them a higher return the first year and even the first 2 years and such, but quickly bring the price into some level of rational cost structure there. So, I think those are two things that are present in Europe that could have impact on overall cost containment.
Yeah, Steve, I agree. I'm not saying we want to follow a European model at all. I always ask the question, why are there so many Europeans sitting next to me in the infusion chair every month? If it's a better system, why are they coming to the U.S. for care? I'm not saying that. I'm saying that we've drawn this rigid line between pharmacy coverage and medical coverage, and no one's been able to really defend that and say why we continue with that. That was a negotiation that was done years ago that has never been completed.
And that's why things like episodes of care and bundle payments and such in the long run may address that and address it better and such. So we're looking at the overall we're actually looking at the real overall cost of taking care of that patient in a defined period of time. I think that may address that issue in time. It will take some time.
This is Jennifer, and I'm going to pivot our conversation a little bit. I think anytime we're talking about value, we're talking about some kind of calculation, whether it's explicit or implicit, of a cost for a benefit achieved. And I think we've spent a bit of time talking about the costs and how that can be broken down in different ways or looked at and evaluated differently across medical or pharmacy benefit and orals or infused. But I want to now look at the denominator of the cost versus benefit equation and think about the ways that we're looking at benefits. And there are some questions from the audience that have come in about how survival versus quality of life from the patient perspective might be evaluated. There are also some questions about the role of PROs and that's patient-reported outcomes and value frameworks, and how patients and how payers might interpret those. So if we can just take the conversation there for a little bit, I think that will help to answer some audience questions. So would anyone like to start with their perspective on PROs and how those might be valued?
One of the tasks, obviously, the oncology care model will that CMMS has proposed is going to have as part of the evaluation the patient perspective and their feeling about value, et cetera. It's very difficult to really measure a patient response because patients are not terribly good judges of quality medical care. Their perception is based more on their interactions with people. Was the receptionist pleasant? Was the physician attentive? Did he answer my questions? Did I have a good experience? Did I have to wait too long and such? Whether they're getting the right therapy or not, the average patient is probably not terribly good about sort of assessing that. But I do think we are going to be, it is the social network digital age in which we're quickly judged in terms of quality on the basis of an interaction, and wait times are right up there at the top of it from patients' perspective. So I think you're going to see more and more satisfaction and patient surveys that look at whether or not it was a good experience and whether or not they feel like they're getting quality care.
Yeah, Jennifer, this is Mike. So I think it's extraordinarily exciting that we will actually start to focus on a patient-driven reporting of impact of therapy on their lives. So I think we have for a very long time focused on regulatory endpoints, and I think everyone on this call will agree that cure or survival is rarely anymore a regulatory endpoint. In fact, there's ample published evidence that progression-free survival or even response rate is the predominant measure that leads to regulatory action. And I would say that if you have an incurable illness, probably that's important, but it may not be the most important thing. So the issue then becomes, all right, if I'm trying to make a decision as a patient in collaboration with my physician about how people like me do with certain therapies, there's a real gap. I think doctors are lousy judges. Doctors are predominantly influenced by their most recent experience, which may not, in fact, be at all representative of what the experience is. So I love the idea that we'll have data collected that we can share with our patients in shared decision-making for therapies that are potentially either not going to extend survival or provide cure. Because I think one of the great fallacies is that oral cancer agents have no toxicity. That's a joke. We have actually lots of evidence that patients, about a third of patients, need a modification of dose or a discontinuation of therapy due to toxicity in the first couple of months. And for many of those therapies, the duration of therapy, unlike what's published in the registration trial, is a matter of a few months, 3 or 4 months. So I think it's great. I think it's just awesome that we'll be able to start using this to help patients navigate, what somebody like me is going to experience if I choose to go with this therapy, given my expectations of clinical benefit and given the realities of what it's going to cost me financially.
Thanks, Mike. And I'm going to go to some more of the questions, and I think what you said plays in just to what some people are asking. So there are a number of people on the line who are from pharma and biotech manufacturers, and they're curious about how these various measures, whether it's PROs, whether the endpoints are looking at overall survival, PFS, quality of life. How can manufacturers, beginning with appropriate clinical trial design and clinical program design, think about these value frameworks and think about how to construct trials, to construct research that best moves and positions their data and hence their products in a light that can really convey the value that these are bringing?
This is Jack. I'd like to take a shot at that. I think biotech and pharma can do something immediately that would be of value to everybody, not just patients, but payers. The entire life sciences industry would benefit, and that is the companion diagnostics that were used in the lab to help create the therapeutic should be moved out to the clinic. If a drug developer is confident that their particular therapeutic will be safe and effective, then back it up. Use the evidence that you used in the lab to come to that conclusion, and take that evidence, better known as a companion diagnostic, and move it out into the clinic. You know, we learned in the software industry to ship diagnostic software with every product that went out the door. And we should do the same thing in biotech and the pharmaceutical industry. The question of who's going to pay for that diagnostic comes up before us all, but I think that would make an immediate difference. Yep, go ahead.
I just would say, you know, a companion diagnostic is often helpful in determining that a patient would not respond to a therapy. It's more of a coin toss with a companion diagnostic about whether or not a patient will respond to a particular therapy. I think practically speaking, the most expensive therapy for any patient is one that you know ahead of time isn't going to work. So I think, you know, Mike and I think his colleagues in the payer industry would be very happy to pay for the diagnostic testing to exclude therapies that you know are not going to work. I mean, these are therapies that are very expensive in general that have companion diagnostics and such. So, you know, that said, I think there will be a willingness. There's already companion diagnostics that are mandated before a particular therapy is initiated on some patients and some diagnosis. But again, I think there's a willingness to do those things. If you look at one of the new PD-1 inhibitors, one of them has a companion diagnostic that was aligned with that therapy. The other one doesn't. So from a practical point of view, it probably would, that companion diagnostic would work for either one of those therapies. But in one circumstance, you're actually excluded from using the therapy if it doesn't test positive. And in the other one, you can use it regardless. So a lot of physicians are going to see that as, well, I'll just use this one so I don't have to do that test and such, because that's just going to screw up my plan for the patient. I don't mean that as an endorsement, but there are going to be some folks who take the easier choice there. I think companion diagnostics are things, and I think it sort of falls in the same category of some of the next-gen sequencing and the broader mutation testing that some of the life science labs have been promoting. You know, at the end of the day, the challenge comes back to the payer, not in terms of, you know, whether or not to pay for the diagnostic. It's what are you going to do with the diagnostic when they find 4 or 5 different potential therapies that are not approved in that diagnosis that physicians are going to want to use as a result of that next-gen sequencing.
Mike, how can pharma and biotech do better in communicating value, and is it a question of data and getting the right data or the right endpoints? I mean, what are payers thinking about this?
Yeah, I must say that most of the dialogue that I have with pharma is regarding whether or not they're going to have an adverse coverage determination or somehow have adverse formulary placement. I don't have, sadly, much dialogue around value. I think, you know, what Jack and Steve have said, which is, you know, it's fundamentally getting the right treatment to the right patient at the right time has always been a mantra. We still sometimes put up impediments. I'm not going to make excuses for that. But I think really the idea that we need to get beyond satisfaction with meeting regulatory endpoints and then looking at strategies for market enhancement, market access. That's the universe we live in. I'm not sure that's the universe we need to live in.
Excellent. And I'm looking through some of the questions. So another question about PROs. Do you think there is potential for PROs using any of these, the new tech being developed, wearables, sensors, as part of real-world evidence? Do you think that any of that plays in at all, and what would be the time horizon for some of those tools?
This is Jack. I'll take a shot at that also. With PROs, there's a whole new field developing, the ePro, electronic patient-reported outcome and clinical outcome assessment. And I think the industry, especially IT, is getting better at defining very specific prognostic and predictive biomarkers. And these biomarkers that are very measurable, that measure response or tell you whether a patient is refractory to a drug or responding positively, I think they should be used. I think they're really, in many cases, they're reliable indicators. The wearables is still, an emerging market. I think it might be useful in the near future. But I think going back to the very basic biomarkers that your oncologist or hematologist might be using, get that data to the patient. Look at the key biomarkers and anticipate adverse effects. Patients aren't even looking at response. In fact, the way we conduct clinical trials, we do everything in batch mode. We don't do anything in real-time mode where we actually measure response within, hours or days of receiving a therapeutic. So I'm very hopeful that these electronic patient-reported outcome systems will come online. The question is, can we really find a group of validated biomarkers that are reliable? We're not there yet. We still got a long ways to go, but I think we're heading in the right direction.
All right.
Yeah, I think a larger and more challenging issue is that, quite frankly, institutions are not very good at reporting or even recognizing their own outcomes. If you ask many of the large academic centers about outcomes in a particular diagnosis and such, they really can't give you that information. I think PROs, as far as the ability to kind of report their experience, whether it be endpoint in terms of cure or improvement or whatever, or just the patient experience and such, I think all those are valuable for patients in terms of selecting the place they want to be cared for. But there's a challenge in interpreting that information in a scientific way.
All right, guys. So we're just about running out of time here. So I just wanted to thank the panel for an extremely telling and interesting conversation, and thank the audience participants for an extremely engaging seminar. Comments were coming through about how this webinar will raise questions throughout the country. Since we didn't get to all the questions, we will try and answer them with follow-up content and, of course, at our Oncology Summit in June. If you think this was valuable discussion, let your colleagues know. It's not too late to sign up to receive the recordings from today. Remember, this was created in line with the 2016 i4Pharma Oncology Market Access and Pricing Summit, June 16th to 17th. We hope to see you guys in Philly. Thank you so much, everybody.
Thanks, all.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.